So, hi everyone. My name is Tobias, or Tobias as you would say in Danish. I do live in New York City. I've lived there for the past 2 years. I'm a person who, and also to the background of me working for the government and for apps and websites, I'm a person who's constantly trying to think, how can design as a discipline, how can we use design to change really, really complex stuff out there in the world? This is why story mapping has become one of my favorite tools to use, because story mapping, as I've found, actually not only helps aligning people and getting people on the same page on what you're building and why you're building it, it also really achieves an alignment across the entire organization on what is it that we want to do. So before I get started with this, I just want to make sure that I know a little bit about you guys as well. So who has ever heard of story mapping or uses story mapping? Okay, that's a great, awesome. Who's ever used story mapping or uses story mapping? And who's used it successfully? Okay. We narrowed in a little bit. I won't say that I've used it successfully always, but hopefully I can give you some tips on how to actually use it in different phases of the project to make it a more successful tool to use throughout the product development process. So a little bit about me first. I'm Tobias. I work in New York City as a product designer. I guess I just went over this slide, actually. Here I am. I try to use design thinking to solve these complex problems out there and try to figure out how can we create these valuable experiences for people. This slide leads me over to the next slide, which is why I work for this company called Blackboard Insurance. This is probably one of the least known companies of all the speakers on this conference. It's also a very new company. It's about 1.5 years old now, and we work on insurance. We are one of those insurtech companies. We try to see if there's any way we can rethink or reimagine this super archaic industry of insurance. We try to do that with a customer value and data-centric approach, meaning that is there a new way we can look at insurance so we make it actually interesting for people, maybe even a good experience, and maybe less boring, right? Because insurance is an industry that has a reputation of not only being boring and tedious for people, it's also an industry that has absolutely no trust, right? You don't really ask a person and they say, oh yeah, I love my insurance company. They only do whatever's best for me, right? It's always this mistrust of this insurance company trying to rip you off and trying to make more money off you. So this is our mission. We want to try to get this asymmetry out of the picture and try to see if we can make insurance more available for everyone. So story mapping is going to be part of that. Story mapping I've found so far, as I said before, to be a super useful tool for aligning everyone in the organization on what you're building and why you're building it. I'm going to go over why I think user story mapping is needed out there now. So I'm going to give a quick introduction of the problem we see out there in the current way we build software. Then I'm going to go over what is actually user story mapping, and then I'm going to go over how can we actually apply this to our own organizations. So before I get started, has anyone seen this video just by looking at this frame before I started? Does anyone recognize this video? Can you see them raising hands? Okay, have you seen it on LinkedIn? So this is a video of the classic game called the telephone game. I know we have a few people here from not the US or an English-speaking country, so does everyone know what the telephone game is? Okay, I'm just going to go over it really quickly. So the basic rules of the telephone game is you sit down with a group, then the first person will start saying something or enacting something or maybe even drawing something, then they will pass that on to the next person in line, and then that person is supposed to say or draw or do whatever that person just saw, okay? Then that is passed on to the next one in line, and to the next one in line, and next one in line, and then eventually you get to a point where maybe you went through 8 people, and then you see what is the result now after this message going through all these people, and then what was in the beginning. So this is an example of that, so let me just show you the video. In this video, this guy, the bald guy, does an action to show some kind of action. You'll see it as well, and then he shows that to the person next to him, who will then show it to the next one. Let me show that video first. So now, I sped up the video. It's 12 minutes long, so I thought I wanted to spend more time on talking about story mapping. So now everyone does that thing that they see from the person before them. It's a very long line of people, and here's the end result. Right? So if you all line up right here, no, I'm kidding. So this is all fun and games, right? It's funny, it's hilarious. We can definitely see why it doesn't really work, even though the guy in the beginning was very elaborate about, I've never seen anyone drive a scooter like this, right? So he was still trying to really make it exaggerated why, or what he was doing. But there's still this big difference between what was started and what was seen in the end, right? So why am I showing you guys this? Why am I talking about the telephone game? Why am I talking about people misunderstanding each other? The reason is, most often when you build software, it can feel like the telephone game. I'm not sure if anyone would agree with me at this point, so let me try to make it a little bit clearer. We write these documents, and I'll go over the document format after, and then we write them down, so we write them down, then we pass them on to someone else, and then we expect that person to read that document exactly how we intended to write them, right? So we write the document, and then we say, here, this is what I want, and then we expect that person to know exactly why we wrote that and what the purpose is of writing that. Then that person will look at it and say, oh, that person wrote it because of this, and then they'll pass it on to the next person. And then eventually you get to a point where it's not a video of 300 people doing this anymore. It's actually real-world software development where people don't really get the idea of why are we doing stuff. So we get to a point most often where even though we're looking, and maybe you guys have also seen this before, we're looking at the same thing, right? We're both standing here looking at the same thing on the ground, but one person would say, oh no, that's a 6. I'm definitely looking at a 6. Another person would say, I'm looking at a number 9, right? I was also thinking about bringing in the dress example of people believing it's gold and yellow and whatever, or white or black and blue. But the idea is people want to, when they look at something, when they see something, they have their own perspective. They have their own idea of what they're looking at. And just because you share a document, just because you share something, it doesn't mean that people actually understand the thing that you're sharing with them. Okay. So this is the document I'm talking about. I'm sure most of you guys, hopefully, are familiar with this format. For the people who are not used to seeing this format, this is called a user story. It's a classic format, the most used out there right now. I wouldn't say it's the only one used. A lot of different variations out there. And it goes like this. As a person, some kind of persona, I want to do something, and then so I can do something, right? So it's like, as a persona, I want to be able to get something done so I can get this task accomplished. I want to accomplish this. I have this goal in mind. The reason why this came about was we needed a better way to think of features from a user perspective, right? This is a user perspective. Now you suddenly frame a feature from a user's perspective, so what's wrong with this, right? Shouldn't be anything wrong. Well, if you get a user story like this, so I'm just gonna, you can read while I'm drinking. The idea gets completely lost, right? I'm not sure if you can see this, but I'm just gonna read it aloud. As an admin, I want to filter users by their job title, so I can filter users by their job title. This is basically a snake biting its own tail, right? You don't really explain anything about this. You just say, I want this feature because I want the feature, right? And this is where eventually you get to a point where if I pass this on to another one, even though I know why, as a designer or a PM or someone else, even though I know why we want to filter users by the job title, because I couldn't formulate in the why section why that's important, then someone else won't be able to understand that. And then I shouldn't expect someone else to look at that and be like, oh yeah, I know exactly why they want to filter by job title. Even worse, if you put it in a format like this, that I'm also sure most of you guys have seen before, where you basically just list out all these features or user stories and divide them up into these chunks, you get to a point where, and I have some questions, like, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? What should the system do for the user? Why in this particular order? What's important about this order? How do things relate to each other? Why do we put this here? Is that related to that one up there? It gets super, super hard to even understand why are we building this. I'm not sure if you share the same frustration, and even worse when you have something like at the bottom of the backlog where you just throw all the cool stuff, but you're never going to do it because you don't really know how or why it's going to fit in, right? So the problem is there is no real clear vision, and it goes all the way back to what is it actually that we should use a user story for. So Jeff Patton says in his book, User Story Mapping, that the real value of stories isn't what's written down in the card, it comes from what we learn when we tell the story. This is exactly what we need to be better at doing when we talk about user stories. We need to go down and say, back to basics and say, this is a story, right? It's not a different way of writing a requirement. This is actually a story about a user, and we need to be able to tell the story to get people to understand it. So I think another point I wanted to make is, stories don't become stories until they're told by someone. So we shouldn't expect that when we write down something on a piece of paper, that someone will be able to understand that story. So eventually we want to get to this point. We want to get to a point where we can look at the same thing and have a shared understanding of what it is actually that we're looking at, right? We want to be at a point where there's no real argument about what it is we're looking at. We all agree. Maybe these guys are still yelling. Maybe they're yelling because they're so happy they agree. We want to get to this point of pointing at the same thing and seeing the same thing. So how do we do that? This book is, I wouldn't call it my Bible, but it's definitely a go-to book for me when I struggle to figure out how do I integrate my UX work into development processes. It's written by Jeff Patton and also Peter Economy, but Jeff Patton gets all the credit. And in his book from 2014, he talks about this story mapping and why he thinks it's super important. So I'm not going to go too much into this book. I just want to say that if you haven't read it, please read it. A lot of people said that they had read it, but if you haven't, do it. In his book, he talks about a story map. What is a story map? Well, a story map is a tool to foster conversation between people in your organization. It's actually a way of taking what you would call a big story, like me going to a conference to speak, which is super large, and then breaking that story into smaller parts. So I'm going to later on also use that example as an example of showing you guys how important it is to think about the bigger picture first, think about the bigger story, and then breaking that into smaller pieces when you get more detailed. By doing this, by having people look at features this way and story map and user stories this way, this is how you get a shared mental model. You look at these three people, they're all looking at the same thing, they're all talking about the same thing, and it's all grounded in the user's journey. So it says here steps and details, right? So the steps are the journey, or the steps are the steps of the journey, and then you have the details which are specifying what happens within each step. Okay? So let me go on to next blank slide. Let me go through the anatomy of a user story map. So a user story map will always look at the persona that's involved in the story. So in this case, in the conference example, I would be a persona that would be in this story. Maybe also the conference organizers would be the people involved in this. Maybe also the other speakers that are at this conference would also be the people involved in this process. Then you want to map out what are the activities that these people go through along this entire story. So again, my story was I go to a conference and I want to speak on a stage. The activities before this will maybe be getting to the location, right? So in this case, Dublin. So I have to take an airplane to Dublin. I also have to get a hotel room. I also have to go to the location. I also have to make sure when I go to location with the stage that I get a badge so I can show people that I'm a speaker and so on and so forth, right? You have all these activities that define this story. Then within these activities, you have your tasks. So what are the tasks that a user or a persona would have to go through to complete these activities? So they're like more granular tasks within the activity. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where you start defining your stories. So, and I call it stories, even though the whole thing is a story, but essentially this is what you would call a user story, right? You get to a point where now you have all these tasks. This is the journey of the user that you want them to take. What are the possibilities for the users to take in each step? So you see I have multiple yellow ones under one task. That means that this should be open, this should be free-thinking, brainstorming about how could we, in the best way possible, enable this user to complete this step. So this list could be super long. Eventually, you're going to have to define what is the release. What do we define as the MVP for this solution? And then you're going to slice that map up in more and more releases, so you can start figuring out how do we prioritize this? How do we look at some features and say, or some stories and say, oh, this story is actually super cool, but let's wait with this for later because what we need now is whatever, X, right? So the user story map is super simple, and I use primarily this for facilitating workshops. I use it for development processes. I'll also go into that later. But the most important thing here is defining what's viable. And I'm sure that a lot of you guys have heard this conversation about MVP, what defines an MVP. Should an MVP be crappy or should an MVP be the most viable in the business? And the truth is, in this case, I would recommend that when you define the viability of an MVP in a story map, you always must go back to what is it that we want to build to understand if we help the user accomplish their goals. So it's always focusing on what is the user trying to accomplish and how can we, by each release, help the user accomplish these things. Okay? One more thing I wanted to mention about a minimum viable product is that both minimum and viable are subjective words, right? This is someone valuing, oh, this is the minimum we need, or this is the most viable. But until you get a shared understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, you won't be able to settle on an MVP. Most often, that's why you get to a point where so many different people have their idea of what an MVP would be, because no one has really looked at something like this and said, oh, this is what we need, right? There's no need to discuss this anymore because now we know this is what we need to make the user able to complete their task or their entire story. So the key to remember here is that it's all about hypotheses. It's all about how do we get this going as fast as possible so we can validate our hypotheses that we set up about our users. So I'm just going to quickly go over some story mapping benefits. First of all, the prioritization aspect. So by being able to map out all the possible solutions for how to solve these steps or enable the user to go through these steps, you also really get to a point where you can prioritize super well. So by mapping it out, you can say, oh, well, this release would be super awesome, but let's wait because this is not going to be table stakes for the users to be able to go through. You can plan releases. You can even start showing roadmaps and argue for roadmaps. If you have an entire journey of a user mapped out and you have all the different possibilities and you've settled on those, then you should be able to show the roadmap for your organization as well. Second one is you get people to communicate, which is super hard. You get people from all different backgrounds to get in and share an understanding of what they're looking at. So you have a map which enables people to look at it and say, oh yeah, I get now why this technology is super important. And this is something you don't really get that often. You don't really get people to look at something and say, oh, I totally understand why we need this. Third one is it makes you think in outcomes. So by having this map of what you want the user to accomplish, and by having this user journey in mind, you think about what are the outcomes that we want to accomplish, or we want to get to. Again, going back to the hypothesis idea, you want to put up hypotheses for how do we reach this outcome, or how do we enable the user to reach this outcome, and what are the outputs that we have to deliver to make the user get to this outcome. So I wouldn't say that it's a matter of outcome versus output. It's just a matter of forcing yourself to not thinking about these features as isolated chunks of work, but thinking more about them in the holistic view of how do we actually enable the user to accomplish something here. And then the last one, and I think it's super important, is proactiveness. So I think as a designer, you can get to a point where you react a lot, right? You react a lot to what you're seeing, you react to problems, and you get to this problem-solving mode where everything has to be a problem for you to be able to solve it. By mapping out a user journey and by understanding what it is that you want to accomplish in this user journey, you get to be a lot more proactive in what you're doing. So of course, a lot of whatever you're mapping out is going to be reactive to what you're seeing, but proactiveness means, oh, look at all these opportunities we have to make the user able to do something, so let's do it. Let's start mapping it out. And then you get in a mindset of using design and using product development as more of a proactive practice than a reactive practice. So just like John before, I'm going to use the model here from UXDX, just because we all know that we have 1,000 different models for how to understand how to carry out product development. So I'm just going to be using this one to get everyone on the same page. What I want to talk about is user story mapping can be used at any phase in the process. I think in Jeff Patton's book, which I totally agree with, he puts a lot of emphasis on the development piece of it, right? So he talks a lot about why is it important to look at user stories in the backlog in more of like a journey format, where what I say is I think it's super important to use user story mapping throughout the entire process. So even for research, I use user story mapping as the first piece every time I start a project, because by using user story mapping and its format for facilitation, I get everyone on the same page in the beginning. I'm not talking about products, I'm not talking about technology. What I'm talking about is what is the user journey and what do we need to understand to be able to design for that user journey. Even when you start getting findings from your user research, you can start iterating on the map and you can start filling it out and say, oh, now we know even more So now there's another step that we have to put into this user journey that we didn't know of before. You can also understand what are the knowledge gaps that you have right now, what are the aspects of the user journey you have absolutely no idea of what you're designing for or why you're designing for it. So I would highly recommend always using user story mapping from the beginning. Next step is the hypothesis step. So as I said before, hypotheses are super important to be able to understand what is the MVP that we want to test or we want to validate. By formulating hypothesis from a user story map, and by being able to say, oh, we think this is going to happen after this, you can, per release, you can start actually testing these and validating these hypotheses even before you get to anything that's related to software. Which brings me to the next point, the prototyping. So I also use, since I am a designer, I use user story mapping for my design process as well. Personally, there's nothing better than me being able to see, oh, this is what the user wants to accomplish, this is how I'm going to design the flow. So why not use that in that process? So I always make sure that whatever user story mapping work I've done before and whatever insights we got from the other phases is fed directly into my design process. So I look at the user story map and I say, oh, this is the MVP. Right? This is what I can start designing for, and this is what we can even validate before we have anything built yet. And then needless to say, I'm just going to cover the blue and the light blue phases of this process. When you get to the build, test, and release phase, this is where it becomes crucial, right? You can use it for, and I've used it for my agile ceremonies where suddenly the developers at grooming, suddenly the developers at planning understand why we're doing stuff, right? If you can say, oh, we're at this step in the process, and now we want the user to be able to do this. They won't have a question of why are we doing this, or why is this important, or this seems unnecessary, or this seems like a lot of work for nothing. Suddenly you can tie everything back to the user journey, and you can say, oh, this is why. This is why we need it. This is why it's important. This is why we put in the sprint at this time right now. It's also really good, again, for release planning. So if you want to have more of a narrative in the way you set up releases and the way that you deliver features, use the user story map. The user story map will tell you exactly what you want to accomplish per release. So when you want to deliver that, you can say, well, these are the features that we are actually delivering to the user, and this is the value that it's going to provide. So a few last things I wanted to talk about. How to do it. So I would always recommend using pens and Post-its. If you are co-located, if you have everyone there, I would always recommend using it for workshops where you can start mapping out the entire user journey. The reason why is that when you have a room to stand in, communication becomes less of a problem or an obstacle than it does when you're over a phone or a Skype call or whatever you're using. So always make sure that if you can, bring everyone in one room physically, because that will force them to have better conversations and get this shared understanding better. If you can't do that, which is also something that I totally understand, tools like Mural or Miro are really, really good at making you able to keep this overview of the diagram that you're creating, the story map that you're creating, and also being able to see the cursors of people where they are. You can vote on stuff. It's super, super easy to use. I've used it successfully many times as well. And then once you start going into the development process, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this tool, but Easy Agile for Jira is actually really, really awesome in the sense that it doesn't really disrupt your normal workflow. So you will have your normal backlog, you'll have everything that looks normal, but now you'll have an extra tab, which is actually the user story map. And you can move tickets around, you can do whatever you want to do in this Easy Agile tab, but it won't mess up your normal backlog or your sprint. So if you just want to test it out, I can highly recommend using Easy Agile's plugin for that. If you're curious about doing a workshop, I also talked about doing workshops. You can look up this title on Medium, And I have a guide for how to carry out, I think it's like a half-day workshop on how to do user story mapping, what people to include, what activities you can do, how to divide up the time, and so on and so forth. So before I end this talk, I'm just going to finish with a quote, and then I have some takeaways as well. So Jeff Patton says again in his book, teams must build a shared understanding and focus on outcomes rather than what to build for their users. So the key here is focus on getting the shared understanding on the outcomes you want to achieve and not just what you want to build. So instead of focusing on, oh, we need this feature and this feature, think about what is it actually that you want to accomplish and how do these features fit into that. So I'm going to do my key takeaways briefly. First one is, don't expect people to fully understand your written requirements. First one, so when you go from this talk and you have your lunch, think about the next time you write a user story, don't expect anyone to look at it and be like, oh, I understand exactly what this person wrote. Second one is, flat backlogs don't show the big picture. So don't expect people to understand the big picture if you use a flat backlog. Collaborate early to achieve shared understanding. So that means everyone in the process. It means developers, it means other subject matter experts, even users. Try to pull them in as soon as possible in the process to get this shared understanding of what you're building and why you're building it. And then the last one is, start telling stories, don't just write them. That was my talk.